Today, we have got our booktube for books that are set in the US. I thought this was a timely one because I've recently have released the books set in the UK and Southeast Asia. I have a lot of close friends who are American. My partner is American, and I thought it seemed like it was time. Now, obviously, there's huge amount of books to come out of the US, so I have focused in on a few classics and then lots of modern ones too. I've tried to have a range of some fiction, historical fiction, memoirs. I'll throw a bit of everything in there. But I suspect this might probably end up being like a part one. And at a later date, I will do a part two. And I'm thinking about doing like a whole one just on classics. Well, before I kick off, I wanted to let you know that this is sponsored by my Book Globe interactive map where you can click on different countries from all around the world and get my book recommendations. It also links back into the YouTube videos so that you can then go and watch my booktube for that country. I'm so excited to share my book globe with you all. I have been working on this interactive clickable map which spins and gives you book recommendations, all curated and read by me from all around the world. Every time I read a book from a new country, I will add it to the map, so the map is only going to keep on growing. Right, I'm kicking off with a book that actually I didn't love that much. And as most of you know, I don't like to be critical of books. I've never written a book, and I was just quite shocked by this one. I love how it came about. So I am talking about Wilson Rawls's Where the Red Fern Grows, which I had never heard of before. And one of my lovely students, last year, she was about 12 years old and from Japan, and she knows a lot of animals. And so she said, Miss, I've read this book. I think you'd really like it. And I love it when my students recommend me books. So I thought, fantastic. Went to the library, went to find it and get it out. And it was totally not what I was expecting. So this book is basically all about dogs that hunt raccoons and kill them, and then they're used for their pelts, which is not quite what I was expecting as an animal lover. But since then I've actually heard references to that book, and it's one of those things where, well, I'd never heard of it before, and now it was referenced in another book I was reading, a Brené Brown non-fiction book. So I thought that was really interesting. So this book was actually written in the 60s, and it's all about rural life in America. It follows a young boy and his obsession with getting a pet, getting dogs, because he wants to go off and hunt raccoons in the area. They are clearly quite an impoverished family. They don't have any shoes. There's lots of struggles for money in the family. So I think it's quite reflective of like some rural communities at the time. I think it's also one of those things where nature comes in. You know, this is rural life. They're in the forest, they're in the streams. He sometimes sleeps outside with his dogs, and that love that he has. And I'm not going to give any spoilers, as always, with this, but I think I didn't kind of realize until the end how emotional this book could be, because I did personally feel quite a lot of resistance to the idea of hunting animals, and which is obviously like my personal bias, but I think to be told, oh, you'll love this book, it's all about animals, that was a little surprising to me. But I am glad I've read it, and obviously since I've realized it's quite an American, so that was definitely eye-opening for me. I think if you're like vegetarian or like a big animal lover, you might struggle a little bit with this book. Okay, number 2, we're springing forward into like modern day times. It is Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. I loved this book. It's got to be up there with some of my favorites on this list. If you had told me before I read this book, oh, it's a book all about video games and video gamers, I would not have read it. So I'm really glad. Actually, my auntie brought it and said, read this book. And said, okay, fine. It's fantastic. So it follows the story mostly of 3 people who become video game designers. And I'm not really into video games, but I teach a lot of students who are, and it gave me this whole new kind of respect for the creativity behind what goes into like creating worlds and this world creation and the ideas behind some of these incredible games. It is extremely sad. You will need your tissues for this one. I'm not going to give any spoilers, but I would say it very much links into the problems in the USA today without giving any spoilers. It's a beautiful love story, platonic love story that happens throughout. You get snippets from the different characters, different perspectives. And I think I love that because you see where all the misunderstanding happens when people aren't being clear, people aren't communicating properly. And it just felt very real, very raw, very authentic. And it hasn't made me want to play video games, but I definitely had like a lot of respect for the creativity and the imagination that goes into it. And it's just a beautiful story. I think it's beautifully written. And let me know if you've read it below, because I feel like this book, I think it's starting to be talked about a bit more now, but I feel like not enough people have been like, read this. Okay. My next one is Janet Walls's The Glass Castle. I have talked about this book before on this channel because it references a lot about poverty. So this is a memoir about the author's own family and her own experience of growing up. It's one of those stories where there's definitely a lot of abuse happening that the children in the family then kind of struggle with and have to come to terms with as they get older. And unlike some of the other books that I read about poverty from around the world, it's a situation where the parents don't want to get out of poverty. They're kind of like these hippie idealists, anti-establishment, anti-paying taxes, very, very kind of knee-jerk reactions to things where actually it is just extremely damaging to their children. Yet, at the same time, you can clearly see that there is love there, particularly with the father in the family who is an alcoholic. And you just see like the ups and downs of how all of the children are just on the receiving end of his drinking, his abuse. The mother is definitely a very difficult to understand character. She's clearly caught up in an abusive relationship. She enables his drinking. She's trained as a teacher, but refuses to get a steady job. So the children are just moved around constantly, shipped from place to place. It's very, just a really unusual situation. And it speaks volumes about poverty, about growing up with trauma. There's some really horrific things that happen to some of the children. Not giving any spoilers, but I imagine they're probably all in quite a bit of therapy now. And ultimately about the strength of those sibling relationships and how they pull their money to get the oldest one out from the family home to New York for a better life, and then the others can try and follow there. And it's really powerful. I think if you told me this was fiction, I'd believe you. And it's really quite terrifying that it isn't and that it did already happen. Okay, number 4 is also a memoir, and it is Educated by Tara Westover. Now, I'm British, and I think I probably have less understanding of what it means to be Mormon than an American audience. So I really read this book and I thought, oh my gosh, like, is this what Mormons are like? However, since after doing some research, I've realized that a lot of the things that happen in Tara Westover's life are very unique to her family situation, and that a lot of Mormons are incredibly shocked by their story, by the family situation, by how the people are treated. So Tara Westover grows up in this incredibly strict, controlled, abusive family in which there is little respect for education. Again, people living on the outside of the law, people coming up with very strange belief system, to the fact where the families say, well, we're not going to wear seatbelts because if we crash and we die, then that is God's will. So they don't wear seatbelts. There's a lot of really horrific accidents that's happened. They work with metal And there's all sorts of things about children in the family being scratched and injured by these cooling metal contraptions in the work that they do. Quite a lot of child labor is happening within this family. And one of the incredible things is that Tara does get some homeschooling. So there is some support there from the family in terms of education, and manages to get herself to university purely kind of on her own merit, and then actually ends up at Cambridge University. Cambridge is actually my hometown where I grew up, and coming to terms with realizing that her family is not like everybody else's. And I think she doesn't really realize to what degree until she goes off to university. Hey, because her experience in the US is also with other Mormons, so there's some similarities there. In terms of like the clothing, the attitudes, the values. So it's a very, very unusual tale, very shocking. Very, as a teacher, I'm just like, God, like where is the protection for these children? And yes, again, such a unusual, unique family situation that she grew up with, and I'm sure is still coming to terms with. Okay, I've gone for a bit of a classic now, and that is The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. Now, I actually studied this when I was at school, so I remember reading this one and To Kill a Mockingbird one summer holiday. And our English teacher had said at the end of the summer holidays, we're going to take a vote on which book to study. And very interestingly, the class mostly voted for Catcher in the Rye, which when I look back now, I think To Kill a Mockingbird is much more an enjoyable read. But anyway, that's a story for another day. And so what happens is not much actually happens in the story. And you get this young teenage boy, and you don't really understand his situation. You get a lot of his internal thought processes. You see his obsession with girls and crushes, and this like coming of age story. And then there's like a big reveal towards the end. This book is like heavily quoted around the world. There's actually some quotes from this on the wall in the school where I work. And I think it's interesting that I identified with it back as a teenager, because it is a lot about like teenage alienation, experiences. And I think probably people might get more from it when they read it as a teenager for the first time. Rather, a lot of things about loneliness in it and about grief. And a lot of expressions I had to learn, like necking means kissing in it, as that was quite unique to that time. It was written in the 50s. And yeah, definitely like a classic that I think is well worth reading. Okay, my next one is another classic. I've gone for Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. Many of you probably have come across this as a film with starring Leonardo DiCaprio, but I actually read the book first before the film came out and really enjoyed it. I think it has some absolutely fantastic quotes in it. I think one of my favorites is about people will tell me, oh, if it was the right girl, then she'd have waited for me. And he says, actually, the right girl doesn't wait for anybody. It definitely talks a lot about like wealth and about class. It's set in the roaring 20s. And just, I think was really, I felt like I learned quite a lot about the time, a lot about like glapper girls and these cultural references that people will use as fancy dress and costume parties nowadays. A lot about glamour and this idea of like the American dream and what it really means. And I really like it as a classic. I think Fitzgerald is one of the most beautiful writers out there. So if you haven't read anything by him before, I think The Great Gatsby is a good start, but I also love The Beautiful and Damned too. Okay, number 7. I actually done a whole separate video on this book because it absolutely astounded me. And I'm still amazed by it. It is The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot. And this is a work of non-fiction that completely bowled me over and opened my eyes. I found it deeply emotional and absolutely riveting to read. Rebecca Skloot is actually a journalist, and there's sections of the book that are from her perspective, And then there's sections of the book that go into the science. So ultimately, Rebecca Skloot was young and studying, and one of her science teachers mentioned to her that, the cells that are used here, they were from a young Black woman. And Rebecca Skloot kind of remembers this and starts to go and investigate, like, who are these cells and what happened? And what happened is probably one of the biggest injustices that happened in the science world. And it links into so many moral questions about that we should all be aware of and all be discussing. So Henrietta Lacks' cells are used today all around the world by pharmaceutical companies, by scientists, by research, and they were taken from her without her consent when or just in the months before, she died brutally of cancer. And this was in the early 50s, and her cells are being sold around the world, and her family are living in poverty and can't even afford health insurance. And this book is kind of expose into how the scientific community have used members of the African American community and exploited them for their research. There's a lot of extremely shady things that have happened in the past, and this is just one of them. And Rebecca goes and interviews her family members, her daughter, and talks about what happened. So it's really this story of the family, and then interweaved with what was happening and the scientific research at the time. Big questions like, if someone takes your cells, for example, during a routine pap smear, science can go and use these cells without your consent at the moment in the US and I believe in the UK. They can use those cells for research purposes. And there's been some really interesting things about who gets to own their own cells. And there was a case that she mentions in the book about a man who realized his cells are very unique, a bit like Henrietta Lacks, and he monetized it. So he actually managed to get rich from it because he, I guess, copyrighted or patented his own cells that then researchers and pharmaceutical companies had to pay him for them. And that did not happen for Henrietta Lacks. And all her daughter and her family really wants is for the world to know her name and know what a hero she has been and how her cells have helped to find cures and develop further research into all sorts of different medical conditions. And it's a really sad story. And I think everyone should know about her. I've told the science teachers, some of my colleagues, like, you guys should read this book. And it is really quite shocking, the racism, the inequality that has existed in a medical community where you think people should actually want to help each other. And I've been really, really gobsmacked by it. Okay, my next one is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee that I mentioned earlier. This is one of the big books written by a Black woman on racism, civil rights, leads into it. It was written in the 60s. Just really like an expose following a family. Someone is wrongly accused and there's a lawyer character in it. So there's lots of legal things. I actually read this quite a long time ago. So I would like to reread it actually, but I wanted to mention it because it is known as like one of the great classics in the US. Okay, my next one I have mentioned before because I think it's so absolutely fantastic, and that is Made by Stephanie Land. This is a memoir of Stephanie getting herself and her daughter out of poverty, out of a domestic violent relationship, and her work as a maid and her struggle to get this better life, to get herself to university, get enough money to feed her daughter and pay lawyers and just improve her situation. And you just root for her the whole way through. They actually made a Netflix series of this that I watched first, and it's quite interesting how different the series and the book are. So the series actually kind of focuses on the abusive relationship, whereas in the book, it's not really about him. And I love that because this is her story and he was just this part of it. And there's a lot about generational poverty in the story, how these families have been growing up in trailers for generations, a lot of just people having to work so hard all the time. Quite a lot about addiction from different family members and her baby daddy's family and himself, who's an addict. A lot of things about like undiagnosed medical conditions, such as her mother, who, when you read it, you're thinking, is she potentially bipolar? And I think it's so shocking how people can be so unsupported by their families. Like in Tara Westover's Educated, for example, like just this complete, like there's nobody there for some of these really young women who then end up becoming mothers at quite a young age. And it just really shocked me. I think I was also really shocked by the stigma that exists towards people in poverty. And I don't think I should be. Maybe I'm quite sheltered to be so shocked by that. But when people saw that she was using food stamps to pay for food in the supermarket, like they'd shout at her and make snide comments and talk about where their tax was going. And I actually can't believe people can be so uncompassionate and unempathetic, particularly towards young single mothers. Like they literally hold up the world, young single mothers everywhere. Like, how on earth are they doing it? How that anger can be so misdirected. Like, I would be so glad that my taxes were going to help people that needed it and not foreign wars and dropping bombs on people. Like, it just really astounded me, to be honest. And if you've read this book, let me know. I think it's so worthy of being talked about all the time. Okay, my next book might actually be my personal favorite from this whole list, but I say that with a very heavy trigger warning because this book is very traumatic to read. It is deeply disturbing and emotional. I would think particularly if you are a Black person who is descended from enslaved people, because this tells the story of the US, of the transatlantic slave trade, all told through one family. So there are sections of this book that are set in Africa and sections that are set in the US. And it spans the last 200 years of history, all told through a multi-generational story. Each chapter is a different character from this story. So it starts off with two sisters in Africa, part of the tribal kingdoms there. One of them marries a white slaver, and then you go down that side of the family history, and one of them becomes an enslaved person and is kidnapped and taken to the US as part of the slave trade. And it is, there's obviously, you can imagine, absolutely horrific abuse, rape, violence, trauma that happened. And you're reading this and you're just thinking, God, like people really experience this. And it is really upsetting, but upsetting in a way that like we should all know about this, because as you can tell from obviously the multi-generations, the impact that happened is just so shocking. I've actually been teaching my students lately. I'm not a history teacher, I teach language, but we teach them words to help with history. And in the curriculum at the moment, they're learning about the Asante Kingdom, and it will lead on to the transatlantic slave trade as a section of history. And it's definitely a section that was very ignored when I was studying history at school, and there were never any links made. So no, we learn about the Industrial Revolution. There was no mention when I learned about that of the slave trade and where that cotton came from. And there was no mention about the Victorian times in a lot of the things that we studied about where the sugar really came from, where the tobacco really came from that people were smoking. Like, we've just been so completely ignored in history. And I'd like to think it's changed, but when I've been listening to the Empire podcast, some of you might know that's one of my favorite podcasts to listen to, like, it doesn't seem like there has been that much of a reckoning with the British Empire and what they're responsible for. in the world today and how it's still affecting families. We know a lot about generational trauma, about how scientists now discovered, trauma is passed down in the DNA and how it's affecting later descendants. I was talking to my students actually, and I said, it feels like a really long time ago. They're 12 and 13. And I said, just to let you know, like my great grandmother was actually born in 1895. And they could believe that. Obviously, kids don't normally have a very good sense of time. But I just wanted them to realize that, like, in terms of generations within a family, that's not that long ago. The things that happened in this novel are not that long ago. I think this is probably one of the best historical fiction books I've ever read. You kind of realize it's really not that fictional. It also, because it follows all the way up until current day, I found that really fascinating as well. Like there are lots of things about people working in the mines in Birmingham. I don't know how to pronounce it in the US version. And a lot about addiction. And there's like a little bit about civil rights in there, but it is much more about the family situation. I learned a lot about kind of customs in some of the African kingdoms and how kind of slavery existed there and how very different the type of slavery that pre-existed there was compared with what happened in the transatlantic slave trade. Just all of it is really hard to read. Like, I think you need to be in a good headspace to be able to cope with the heavy content. But I think it's absolutely a book that everyone should read, particularly all Americans, because it explains so much. I'm a huge fan of Yagyasi. Anyway, I'd read one of her other books previous to this, which I'm going to mention in a moment. But even just seeing the front cover, it gets to me. So another book I want to mention, which I'd never heard of before, I just came across it in the library, and it is called The Wedding by Dorothy West. It's all set in Martha's Vineyard, which I've always thought sounds like a very beautiful place, but I didn't know much about it. And it's followed a community of Black people who are wealthy and who are the elite, and explores like class tensions. It explores what it means to be like a wealthy Black family at the time. It's all pitched around this wedding that happens in the summer in the 50s, where a family is gathering, and you get these snippets of the different neighbors that live there. You get attitudes towards different family members, different neighbors, attitudes towards white people, attitudes towards interracial marriage and relationships, and a lot about like colorism between the families as well. And I think it was really eye-opening. Like, I've never really read a book like this one before. It's very short. So I think if you were looking for like a quick win from this list, then I would go for The Wedding by Dorothy West. And I did a bit of research into her afterwards because I had never heard of her before. And she's a huge deal. She published it later in life, and she was part of something called the Harlem Renaissance, which I went on a bit of a deep dive to research into. Just really kind of eye-opening about society, about those tensions at the time. I read that Jackie O was the one that encouraged her to finish it. So she's definitely like a very well-connected writer who was being published at the time. And she worked on this book for quite a long time in her life, I believe. Okay, my next book, I'm going back to Yagyasi because I love her so much. And I want to talk about Transcendent Kingdom. I'm a bit gutted I returned my book to the library. It's got one of the most beautiful book covers that are out there. And this book focuses all on a Ghanaian immigrant family in more modern day US. And it covers what happens, this isn't a spoiler, but what happens to one of the family members who dies. Too much. Okay, it's difficult to talk about this one without any spoilers, but it definitely references like very poignant things that have happened in more recent years in the US. where there's kind of a big boom in exploring some of them. It talks about addiction. If you are into science, it's quite interesting because the protagonist is doing research on mice into dopamine and addiction and things like that. And at the heart of the story is this struggling family to deal with the death that has happened and the very strange relationship that the daughter has with her mother, and she comes to stay with her, and the daughter's avoidance to engage properly in life. And you just really root for this family, for what they've been through. It felt very personalized somehow. Like it almost reads like it could be a memoir. I don't believe it is, but it's very eye-opening, absolutely beautifully written. I love the prose and the way that Jan writes. If you want to access her writing, but maybe homegoing is feeling a little heavy for you, then I definitely go for Transcendent Kingdom. It is still heavy, but definitely not on the same level of, like crying all the time, like I was when I read Homegoing. Okay, my next two, I kept getting confused because they're very similar settings. They are both by Barbara Kingsolver, who I love as a writer, and they are Flight Behavior and Prodigal Summer. So I'm going to kind of talk about them together because both of them are set in the Appalachian Mountains, which sound absolutely amazing. And now I want to visit after having read her novels there. And they both are similar in that they focus on like small rural town life, changes that are happening for the farming community there, modernize. One of the stories is I would say they're both like very much nature focused, which obviously I loved. There's a whole thing on Flight Behavior about butterflies. The cover's got this beautiful monarch butterfly on the front of it. And it's talking about ecological changes that are happening, but as well as changes within the community, attitudes that are maybe quite behind in some of our viewpoints. And the protagonist in Flight Behavior is right at the beginning. She's contemplating having an affair to get out from her marriage, her unhappy marriage, and unhappy being a housewife, and the knock-on effect of that. And yeah, Prodigal Summer is similar. Like the protagonist is a woman who is living out in the mountains for a section in Appalachia, and really beautifully written. I think if I was going to go for one of them, I'd go for Flight Behavior because I think the story is a little bit more driven with the plot and the following of the main family. So yes, I would pick that one first about the book. Okay, my next one is Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. Now, I refused to watch the film of this because I thought they're going to ruin it. So I read the book only, absolutely loved it. I thought it was really like quirky, the big twist at the end, which obviously I will not spoil, that I really didn't see coming as well. And just these like fantastic areas of nature, talking about the marshlands, the swamps and the marshlands of North Carolina, and a lot of people's attitudes there in these very nature orientated communities. And I loved a lot of the things about boats and exploring. And the main character, she is a young girl and she has to bring herself up. A lot of family abandonment issues, and then there's like these twisting things that happen, and you're trying to work out like who's good in the story, who's not good in the story. And yeah, just about having a childhood and like being at one with nature. And I loved that side of it, definitely. I think a lot of things like coming of age in a world of nature. Know that some people have said that they thought that this was like really overhyped and were disappointed by the book. I hadn't heard that much about it when I read it. I just picked it up in an airport bookstore once. So perhaps that's why I approached it in a different way, and I did really enjoy the story. Okay, my next one is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I don't want to say too much about this because I feel like the main things I want to talk about are spoilers, but it basically follows um, a young woman who is interviewing a big famous Hollywood star and how everything like unravels during their many interviews that they do over the course of the book. We find out what's behind all this Hollywood glamour and lots of things that are hidden and unsaid. There's a twist at the end that I definitely did not see coming, but I kind of knew there was something there. And I think it's a really enjoyable read. It's not too heavy, I would say. There are a couple of upsetting things that happen in the novel. But overall, I would say like a very enjoyable read and a lot about old school Hollywood glamour. Okay, my next one is by Lisa C., who I absolutely loved. Her book, The Island of Sea Women, which I'm going to talk about in another episode, all set in Korea. However, this novel is set between China and the US. It is called Shanghai Girls. Definitely needs to come with a trigger warning because there's some very deeply upsetting things that happens, but particularly quite early on at the start where the people of China have been invaded by the Japanese and the brutalities that happen there. And so there are these two sisters that then flee from Shanghai and end up trying to survive as refugees and immigrants in the US. I learned so much from this book about like what it meant to be an immigrant in the US at the time that it's set in the 1930s, how they were kind of kept on an island and not allowed off bits, about just a lot about like culturally and historical things that I didn't know about at the time, ways that people were trying to bring people from China to protect them from what was going on there. Just a lot of really interesting things happened in this book. And I don't know if I can say I really enjoyed it because there's quite a lot of upsetting things that happened to the characters, but it's definitely, I think, some really prominent historical fiction. That again, I just picked up this book in the library. I didn't know anything about it before. I realized it's by Lisa C. until I was probably making this video and I realized, oh my gosh, she did The Island of Sea Women. So yeah, I really recommend it. And particularly about the Chinese American experience. Okay, my next one is again needs to come with a heavy trigger warning. This book, it is Girls Burn Brighter by Shobha Rao. And I think talking about this book at the moment is very poignant and on topic because we've been talking a lot in the news about the trafficking of young girls around the world, and that is what this focuses on. So the first part of this novel is set in India, where there are two girls who become best friends in a rural area in India, and some horrific things happen. They become separated, and one of them is trafficked to the US under the guise of working as a cleaner. And what actually happens is it is the sex industry. There's some truly, truly horrific rape scenes in this book. It is a lot about the abuse of young girls by men in power, something that is very topical at the moment. It's really upsetting. I spent a lot of this book in tears. I think it's one of those books where you start off reading it and you're like, oh yeah, like there's really this underworld in India. And, some of us who've seen Slumdog Millionaire, for example, would think, oh yeah, that underworld exists there. And I think this book does a really good of exposing how those crimes that are happening are actually international. It is not only one country, and we need to do more to protect children and young women from human trafficking and the crimes that are being committed by men all around the world. The kind of the one bond and the emotional payoff of the book is between the two friends. And hence the name, Girls Burn Brighter. But I'm not going to lie, it's a very, very brutal book to read. Okay, my next book is another classic that I think debated a lot is John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. Now, this is kind of taught in schools a lot at the moment. I didn't study this when I was at school or at university, but I have been in classes where it's been studied since. And I can understand why people feel that we don't need to necessarily be studying this. It's used as a way to talk about racism, but it's all written by a white man. And so I definitely think there are better books out there for discussing racism with young people and with students in the classroom. I think as a like a standalone text, I think it's very powerful. It follows two men in the gold rush era in the 90s who are kind of looking for work. So, like nomadic workers who would move around trying to find some sort of stable job. And one of them quite clearly has like some special needs and a disability, and the friend has to look after him. It's a lot about how the American dream doesn't exist, how people think, oh, if we just save up money, we'll be able to get free of this. A lot about attitudes towards women, which we're always shown like, oh, this was the attitude at the time, but I have some questions about John Steinbeck himself and his attitude towards women, because of the only female character in the book doesn't even have a name. So yeah, I've got a lot to say and think about that, but I don't want to give too many spoilers either. The Black character in the book is very discriminated against. Again, there's only one, but he is one of the few who could actually read and is educated. So there's some things that are like meant to be exposed and flipped there. I think it's interesting as like a slice of American history. And I do think the ending of the book it builds a lot of tension up to that point. And I think it's a very powerful ending. Okay. My next book, again, is totally random. It is called Billionaire Buddha by a woman who goes as Sun Rivera. And yes, she's a bit of a hippie, as you can tell by her name. And it's kind of like this, not a rags to riches story. It's a riches to rags to like renewal. So it's I think it's a fictional story until the end. Fictional story based upon a man billionaire who owns like this whole mountain golf resort, has everything he wants, is in an extremely unhappy marriage, doesn't have any connections around him. And at one point during one of the dinners where he's entertaining business people, a waitress taps him on the back or places, and he suddenly realizes, like, that's the first time that anyone has physically touched me in years. And he has this massive breakdown and decides he wants to give up all of his riches. None of it is making him happy, and trying to give it all away. He's aware he's destroyed huge swathes of forest and land area to build his resorts. And it's like this idea of him trying to come to terms with being spiritual. There's a lot. Then he descends completely into homelessness. So this kind of swinging between the luxury world and the world of what it's like to be homeless. There's an ongoing love story. He meets someone that is threaded all the way through. And I don't think this was a spoiler, but at the end, I did a bit of research because there's this bit at the end and I couldn't quite figure out what it meant. But the writer, she actually wrote this based on her partner's own experiences. So he was an extremely wealthy man and gave it all up to live in a commune where I believe they still live now, somewhere in the US, and to give it all up because they realized how money isn't worth it, how corrupt and disgusting the world, the luxury world is. And the only way to fight against it is to not become part of it. So it was really an interesting read. It's very over the top, exaggeratedly written with all sorts of metaphors and similes. And at one point I wondered, is this too much? And then I thought, actually, no, like I really love it. She's written a lot of books for children, but this is a story for adults. And I just thought that was quite interesting. Yeah, real story of what it means to be rich in America and how they're not the true riches in life. Okay, My next one is a very sad memoir that I read by Joan Didion called A Year of Magical Thinking. And I've concluded it because she is one of the icons to write about grief, and I thought it would be more uplifting than it was. I don't know why I thought that. I think because of the magical thinking part, but actually the magical thinking is that she expects her husband to still be alive even after she's watched him die, and to keep coming back to her. And it's very like this ode to him and his life and their life together, and her struggle to come to terms with it, her refusal to come to terms with it, how grief can show up, how you can be hit multiple times. There's a lot of things with her daughter at the time as well, where she believes she might even lose her daughter. A lot of like going back over and over thinking about what she could have done, if anything could have been done differently to save him. Some anger there at him and him leaving her. It's really, very intriguing the way it's written. I thought it would be like, I guess, I don't know, a more coming to terms with grief account, whereas it's really not. It's very raw and authentic and not inspirational, very real. Okay, the next one I'm going to talk about has probably been talked about a lot so far, but I just read it recently. It is Yellow Face by Rebecca F. Kwang. All of her books are so different. Like, I can't actually believe that she's the same author of like Babel and then The Poppy Wars and then this. Like, they seem like totally different authors, which is such a testament to how she can write. And so for any of you who've not come across Yellow Face, which I will be surprised because it's been talked about for ages and everyone's been telling me to read it for ages, and I finally did. The protagonist in the story is a white woman. Right at the beginning, one of her friends, I'm going to say, who is also a novelist, dies, and she has written a book that has been finished, and the friend who's still alive takes the book and pretends that she's written it and takes all the credit. And it's about this lie that she spins. There's a lot of things. So her friend is Asian, so that's the reference Yellow Face comes from, like she's pretending like that she wrote this book by an Asian woman, and a lot of people assuming, because of the way it was written, that it must have been written by an Asian woman, and then they're surprised when the white woman shows up. And a lot of very on-topic things about race and racism, and you just really don't like the protagonist at all. And I found myself, I'm just like waiting for her downfall, like what's it going to be? And some people have told me recently, I can't get behind like a book where I don't like the main character, but I did, because you want to see like, what is she playing at? Like, where is she going with this? And then other things get revealed about the friendship where you maybe have some moments of sympathy towards the main character, because then you realize the characters are quite awful as well. And I would say a very enjoyable read. I read it super quickly, and it's, just very, very entertaining. Okay, my next book is actually a young adult book that I found in the library. It is called The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie. And he is a Native American, hence the part-time Indian, that's what it refers to, a member of the indigenous community in the US. And I learned a lot from reading this novel. It's like a humorous read, but quite a lot of dark humor. It's got sections where there's cartoon things that are like written in the novel like this, and a lot about like his family. I've been very shocked by lots of the things about alcoholism and addiction in the novel. I can't guess as an outsider to the US, I was kind of aware that on reservations there are people with drinking problems, and I think I didn't really realize to what extent until I read this novel, where I mean, it obviously says it's absolutely true, so obviously some of it is taken with a pinch of salt, but I did do some research, and a lot of the things in this book did really happen. I think he mentions at one point that there's only like 5 people who he knows of who don't drink, which is really just quite gobsmacking and just the amount of drunk driving accidents that occur. It's really about like also his like desperation for a better life for himself to get out. So there's the reservation school. There's a lot of like racism that has existed from the white teachers towards the students there, and a teacher admits it to him at one point, and he manages to get himself into a school that is outside of the reservation, but then where he is an outsider and he's the only non-white kid, and about his struggles there of trying to fit in, struggles with his best friend on the reservation, and the tension it causes where he's trying to work his way out into a better life. And it was very eye-opening. I definitely want to read more like Native American literature. And yeah, about teenagers and trying to find your identity in this very complex situation of living on a reservation, wanting to better yourself and become more educated and go to a school where you might have a chance of further study and go to university. A lot about poverty as well, and what it means to grow up with this community of amazing people around you, but where there's always poverty and potential hunger lingering in the background. And some surprising things that happen with kind of some of his new friends at the new school as well, which I wasn't quite prepared for too. Okay, I wanted to talk about this book because I know it's obviously hugely controversial. So it is Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. And this used to be, I guess, like one of my favorite classics. I read it when I was about 16 or 17, and I kind of love with this epic idea of the character of Scarlett O'Hara, her feminist before feminism, the love story. I love an ending that isn't a happy ending love story. I think at the time, like, I just really didn't realize the implications, I guess, of centering such a white voice, such a voice that would have been pro-Confederacy, pro-slavery. The depictions of the Black people in the book are pretty awful, insulting, offensive. And I guess in some ways, I feel like we've come a long way, that everyone raved about this book and then they've realized now how problematic it is, myself included. Did love the film with Vivian Leigh as well. And I think I felt at the time when I read it, I haven't really heard like a voice like this of the plantation owners, because I've read other books like Uncle Tom's Cabin and Harriet Beecher Stowe. And I think this was the first time I saw like the other perspective and the idea of what it means, like when you were in the plantation white family and then losing it all during the war. So it's definitely like a perspective that happened there. But I think this perspective has clearly like eclipsed all the other ones. And I think we now understand, understood all along, that the racist portrayals of the characters in the book, this idea that like the Black people wouldn't want to be liberated by the North. I think it's a kind of a great epic in terms of like survival and how the mighty have fallen. And I definitely learned quite a lot about the American Civil War. That was the first experience of reading about that. But I can definitely see how the character in this book are definitely cancelled in today's society, which I just see as a positive, that we have come a long way in terms of what we're discussing and what is right to be centered as a voice during that time. It was written in very similar to the Of Mice and Men timing as well. So I think shows the attitudes at the time, what was popular at the time, this idea of like, we were, like the Confederacy and like the lost cause that people have been fighting for, and this idea of who survives. And I think it was very good at showing the collapse of that society at the time, which I think really does come into like other great American classics like Streetcar Named Desire, which I'm not going to talk about in today's one. in other times and places. But yeah, that background of the South has fallen and what that meant for those rich white families at the time. I think there's also definitely some like problematic things with the way that the men are shown in the novel, particularly like the relationship between her and Rhett Butler, meant to be this big romance, and some of it I would say nowadays is extremely uncomfortable to read, which I don't believe was like her purpose at the time. So yeah, I do think this is a very problematic novel. It does tell you a lot about the attitudes at the time, and I think still perhaps is worth reading in context with other books like Homegoing, for example. Okay, my last book is Isabel Allende, The Wind Knows My Name. And I'm a huge Isabel Allende fan. And this book was very unlike any of her other novels. It focuses actually on quite a lot of different countries, but the main theme running through them all is refugees and migration. So it starts off right at the beginning and you think, oh, it's a novel about World War II, about the Holocaust. There's a Jewish kid who's trying to escape right at the beginning. And then it kind of bounces all over the place. And then there's a thread, and you end up in much more modern times about the deportations of families being split up at the border by immigration in the US and Mexico. And there's a lot of Central American characters that are in the novel, some lawyers, and it's just very like all encapsulating and very of the time. And the section of this set over COVID as well, and the pandemic and what that did in terms of for families, a lot about being split up, and just really, really exceptional and of our time and empathetic and compassionate towards people and what they're fleeing and what they can't go home to and are sometimes deported home to. Really just quite shocking about that. But I definitely recommend it. As I am a huge Isabel Allende fan. Thank you for listening to our book set in the US. There will undoubtedly be a part 2 at some point, so subscribe for that for future book recommendations.